Welcome to the Educational Physics Podcast. I am your host, João Figueiredo. This is Season 3 of the Educational Physics Podcast. I hope to speak about many issues. I hope to speak to guests about many issues. And I hope that we together can discuss the future of education in an honest and open way. Please consider subscribing, sharing, liking, and commenting. Your support is much appreciated. Thank you. Hello, welcome to another episode of the Educational Physics Podcast. Today I'm going to continue and finish this series on learner-centered education. I will most likely be talking about this again, but I did say on the first episode of this season that I wanted to make a case for learner-centered education from as many angles as possible. And so far we've covered the evolutionary angle, the psychological angle, the philosophical angle, and today I'm going to make the case for the lazy angle. Okay. So obviously, I'm not defending that teachers should be lazy. You should not be lazy. But I do have a take on preparing lessons that is a little unorthodox. For context, I do have the luxury that most of my work is one-on-one. I do run some group classes, but again, most of my work is indeed one-on-one. And so, my take on teaching private students is quite straightforward. In my opinion, the student prepares the lesson, not me. My job is to facilitate what they wish to work on and what they need to work on, and fundamentally just let them guide the process. Now, this is textbook learner-centered education, right? Here's how I go about this. Whenever a student comes into my room and we start the lesson, the first thing we do is a warm-up. You can think of warm-ups for yourselves, for whatever you teach, but that's what we do. We go straight into it, we start playing some music. During that time, I am constantly assessing by watching, by observation, what the student needs to work on. Now, sometimes the student was asked to work on a specific exercise during the week, and that's what we do, if that's the case. But every now and then, I pick up on something during those warm-ups that needs work. And so we focus on that. We work on that specific thing. So that's kind of what I mean by the student dictates the lesson. Now, why am I calling this the lazy angle? Well, because you don't have to worry about preparing lessons virtually ever. The students themselves will do that job for you. Now, you might say, yeah, but students don't really do that. They do, even when they don't. So a student who doesn't work at home, let's say, he hasn't done his homeworks or practiced whatever you need from them, well, then he's prepared his lesson because it's going to be the same as last week's or as yesterday's. As simple as that, isn't it? If you're teaching a class, this is still possible. It is more difficult. It takes a different approach, but I still allow, or more than allow, I still promote an environment where the students will still dictate the course of the class or lesson. So in the context of a group, it's quite simple. Once again, in this case, I would maybe have a specific topic planned, but then as the lesson is developing, I'm observing, and this is the key word, isn't it? Observing. You have to observe your students. You have to be attentive to how they are understanding and applying that knowledge. If you are watching carefully you will see exactly where to take the lesson next. We have to understand that people, humans, children, adults, we have patterns of learning, meaning there's certain ways by which we learn. Now, that's not the same for everyone, but it's not infinite, the options. The options are not infinite. There's only so many different ways people learn and process information. And the more you observe, the more you'll find the patterns, as I mentioned earlier. And so, by identifying those patterns, you will be able to create tools that you can use to then address those issues. The tools, the response to the issues raised by the students, even if not verbally, is the content of the lessons. That becomes, quote unquote, the curriculum. The tools that tackle those recurring issues, and recurring not necessarily for the one person but across people. That's kind of my toolbox. So it's, I've been teaching now for 15 years, and it's becoming quite difficult to surprise me, and I hope that still happens, because I try to stay as open-minded as possible, and every now and then some people are sort of a new puzzle, and that's awesome because it keeps me on my toes and my ego in check. But it is difficult to surprise me, not because I've got some special talent, but precisely because there's so much repetition across people, once again, that you start to understand the patterns. What is also fundamental for us to understand here when it comes to teaching is that teaching, as well as parenting, is a game of stages. So before I continue with that line of thinking, I want to preface that by saying that the next few videos that I'm gonna put out, or podcasts if you're just listening, will be on informal education. Informal education. I feel like it's a field of education, evidently, that still needs to be understood, because we kind of understand how formal education works, regardless of whether you agree with how it works or doesn't, or you don't, but we kind of understand how it works for the most part. But informal education is kind of an interesting one, because it falls into the categories of parenting, or friendships, relationships at work, loving relationships, because we are all teaching each other all the time, everywhere, and that's, again, for me, in my opinion, that all falls under the category of informal education. If we are sensitive to, I guess, two ideas here, pedagogy and psychology, if we are sensitive to those ideas, so you might be listening to this podcast and you're not an educator, and maybe you're not even a parent, but you're in a relationship with someone else. Well, you're learning from that person, and that person is learning from you. Now you have to think, is he or she learning what you want them to learn about you? Are you sensitive to the way people learn? Are you giving away the correct message? Or are you, because of lack of awareness, for example, which is a huge one, are you corrupting the message that they are receiving because you don't know how to communicate, or you don't know how people receive ideas, or that person even specifically? And that I find that extremely interesting, and so we will navigate those waters here on the podcast on how to deal with informal education. I'm going to talk about parenting, I'm going to talk about relationships, So going back to the idea of it's a game of stages teaching. Whenever I'm teaching a student of a specific age range, I always bear in mind, okay, what kind of answers is this person looking to get from the world? As humans develop, we go through different stages of what we are trying to get from the world. Children, as we know, when they're born, fundamentally what they're trying to answer is the question, can I trust my primary caretakers? That could be their parents or whoever. But the big question, the meta question for them is an issue of trust. How do we, as parents or teachers, although as teachers we would not necessarily be engaging with a newborn, but how can we provide those answers and provide answers that do promote healthy growth and development? Well, we have to understand what the questions are. And at each stage of development, the questions change because we get answers. And I'm not going to talk about today anyway, about the cases when the child does not get the answers that they need and they are forced to move on without an answer, and what that leads to, which is very often trauma. Trauma is or can be the result of unanswered meta questions. For instance, in a situation where a child has to grow up too fast and is had to repress the question and move on. Now, what happens to that question? Does it become obsolete or does it become irrelevant? Not at all. And it comes back to metaphorically, and perhaps not so metaphorically, haunt them. And those behaviors that we could not organize as a child come back in adulthood, and then we see, adults behaving like children, especially at the emotional level. I'm not talking about an adult who's a bit silly. I'm talking about an adult who throws a tantrum whenever someone says no. That's what I'm talking about. Because as a child, they were not guided appropriately appropriately to their age. They were not guided and shown how to navigate the waters of rejection, for example. And as teachers, we have to understand this as well, right? If I'm observing a student and I'm seeing that this student is struggling to cope with the situation at hand, I have to be sensitive to what parts of that person am I dealing with at that point in time, what characters of their mind's, theater am I dealing with, what meta questions might they be going through at that point in life. If I'm teaching a student who's a teenager, and the questions they're asking are different, right? They're seeking validation and integration, identity. They're trying to understand where they fit in the world. And that's very deep and difficult. And so as teachers, we have to be very empathetic to that journey, right? Towards that journey. Because if I just shut the kid down or the teenager down and say, no, do what I'm telling you because I said so, yeah, guess what's going to happen? That's a teenager already just looking for an excuse to rebel against the world because they're going through so much change and pain and frustration that as soon as you become the enemy, they'll take it. Or let me change the way I said that. As soon as you become someone that they can identify and label as the enemy, they'll do it, right? So why would I do that? That's just compromising the mission that I'm on with these students, which is I want to help them in their learning process. So there's no point for me to be the quote unquote enemy. What's the point? If a child is seeking, I'll give you an example from my personal experience. I taught a child years ago that really struggled with criticism. Now, what was the problem here? Well, in his familiar environment, so at home, he had certain circumstances within his family that caused some potentially some anxiety around his notion and sense of stability and predictability, which is quite important for a child to be able to trust their environment to not be changing on a daily basis. And his family, to compensate for all the weirdness, I'm gonna put it like that, to compensate for all the odd choices that were being made, they were constantly feeding his self-esteem with vague and at times unjustified praise. Now, this is a very difficult situation to be in, right? Because should you not be praising your children? Well, yes, but not always, right? Praise has to be earned and deserved, and when I give praise to my child, which I do often because, as biased as I am, and I am, he's a great kid who tries hard, who understands failure and knows what to do with it. Even when he's upset, even when he wants to cry and give up, we help him, we guide him through those waters of, that hurt that we feel whenever we fail. And it's not failure, right? We just make a mistake or we haven't achieved yet, but it's not failure. But for the purpose of this conversation, let's call it failure. So whenever the child fails, we have to help them navigate those waters. And this kid that I taught a few years ago, whenever he received criticism, and sometimes it wasn't even criticism, how do I put it? Negative criticism. It was feedback on how to improve. So it wasn't even like that he was making mistakes, but I can say this with some sadness, and I take responsibility as well over this, but his development was very, very behind in terms of his skill set for the class that we were doing. Very behind compared to someone who had been doing that class for the same amount of time and of the same age. He was not progressing, and the reason why he was not progressing is because he refused to accept the idea that what he was doing was not already good enough. He didn't have a practical sense of ambition. His ambition was very idealistic. It was a notion of, I'm good because I say so. Of course, which translated means I'm good because my parents say that I'm good regardless of what I do. So he had no notion of improvement or we can still do better, and you're going to feel proud of yourself because you've achieved something, not because I blindly constantly say that you're perfect and you can do no wrong. Yes, we have to praise our children, but again, it's a game of stages. That child was not 5 years old, right? A 5-year-old probably needs a bit more praise over more mundane things, right? Which is absolutely fine because that's the phase they are in, right? When my kid shows concern for another kid, which you'd say like, yeah, but that's pretty basic, isn't it? It's not really basic at age 4, 5, 6, right? If they are starting to show the ability to look outwardly and care for a friend or even for their parents, not take care of them, mind you, but show care, right? If For a 2-year-old, if I bang my hand on a door or something, it's not gonna dawn on them to ask, "Are you okay?" It's not something really that they are very concerned about. As they start to show those skills to look up and ask, like, "Are you okay, daddy?" Or "Are you okay?" to a friend, and help them up, and if the friend is crying, they cheer them up and they say something nice. Well, that's to be praised. At age 14, that shouldn't feel like novelty anymore. Not again, this is not something that should not be praised, but should we make a big fuss out of it? Like, "Hey buddy, good on you for asking me how I'm doing." At age 14, we should be looking at other things, right? To work with and to praise and to develop with the child or to the teenager. And so, and I'm gonna start to close this podcast with, we have to understand the stages in which the student or child that you might have as a parent are. Where are they in the development, and slash where should they be in that development? And we have to also allow them to take charge and carve their own path. And sometimes it's going to be frustrating. And yes, as caretakers, we have to also assess and allow them to understand that you're also having to constantly decide when it's appropriate to waste a little more time and when it's not appropriate, and you just have to follow instructions. E.g., you got to get ready for school, and no, we don't have 2.5 hours for you to decide when to brush your teeth. It's now. And that process is extremely important, because if we don't go through that process with them, it becomes an authoritarian versus an oppressed person, right? And we don't want that sort of relationship with our kids or with our students. We don't want that. Trust me, even if you think that you want it, you don't want it for your benefit, for their benefit. What you want is them to be in on it, and to give them the autonomy to push forwards, to give them the autonomy to motivate themselves, and then so they can, and then provide the space for them to want to come to you for guidance, but also to show how well they're doing, which of course it's a way to ask for validation and praise, and you should give it when deserved, when earned. If they push themselves, if they're capable of navigating all those meta questions that they are going through, of course you should praise them. And so the learner-centered education model is really about this. It's about understanding that people are going through their own journey, and the fact that it's their own journey means precisely that we have to respect the uniqueness of that journey, whilst also understanding and acquiring the knowledge that allows us to identify the patterns across people. And so we start to somewhat categorize the way people learn as a guiding principle, right? We don't have to stick to these principles like religiously, but it does help to have some sort of roadmap. Let the students guide the process of learning. Let the students guide the process of teaching. Don't over prepare, because lessons will go sideways and they will change directions and we will take tangents. And so if you over prepare and you want to commit to, I have to do this exactly as I planned, you're going to feel frustrated, because you're going to feel like the student is getting in the way and you're the one getting in the way, right? Yes, sometimes we have to remind students that if you're trying to help them, maybe they shouldn't constantly be interrupting. because otherwise you can't even help them. But as long as they are asking questions, give them space. As long as they are exploring thoughts, give them space. When you need your own space to, like I said, to facilitate the next steps, because now you need to give them some sort of, some tips, some guidance. Yes, okay, it is time to ask for some time to explain the ideas and etc. etc. And so you can ask questions back as well, as I talked about in the previous episode with the Socratic inquiry model, where you have to ask questions, and that means that the student needs to give you the space to ask those questions. But other than that, I'd say let the students guide it, right? Don't worry about time management too much. There's always tomorrow. Don't worry about lesson planning too much. There's always tomorrow. You will address the things that you need to address, because guess what? Most people, including very young children, they are way more aware of what they need to learn than what you think. And they are also way stronger, and they have way more resilience than what you think. You just need to allow them to bring that out of them. And that's our role as educators and as parents. Allow them to get that out of them, the resilience, the effort, the desire to go farther. Just allow them to pull it out of them through struggle, controlled struggle. Don't set them up to fail. Set them up to struggle. Set them up to struggle. That's a good way to close today's episode. Like I said, the next few episodes will be on the different stages of development, and we'll talk about how we can use that knowledge within the context of informal education, so outside the classroom. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Please share, like, comment, subscribe, review, the whole thing. And I look forward to speaking to you again. Take care. Bye-bye.